Hello. Today I want to continue my summary of Alistair Parker's book, The Second World War, this time dealing with the China War and Japanese options. This forms part of Chapter 5 of Parker's book, The United States Enters the War, The Origins of the Japanese Attack. So, in 1932, the Japanese army made an unsuccessful attempt to extend Japanese control to Shanghai, but in 1933 he succeeded in conquering the Chinese province of Johor, adding it to its puppet state of Manchukuo. A loosely negotiated truce existed for several years, whilst the Japanese army looked for Chinese leaders who would accept and safeguard Japanese mercantile interests. One reason for the truce was that Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, was more concerned to check the Chinese communists than to challenge the Japanese. But in December 1936, some of his own men revolted against him, favoring cooperation with the communists against the Japanese. This made it clear to Chiang that he must at least pose as an anti-Japanese nationalist and evade Japanese attempts to win his collaboration. What should Japanese policy be? In May 1936, the Japanese Army and Navy agreed between them that the defense of Japan required preparations against the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and China, but they disagreed as to the timing and priorities of their policies. How far should existing resources be developed? How far and to where should they be extended? Which threats should be countered first, and when? Actual circumstances dictated the choices that were eventually made, which led to war and finally to defeat. The main problem for the Japanese was how to increase economic resources and make them secure. Between the wars, Japan was even more dependent on exports than Britain was. About 1/3 of Japanese manufactures were probably sold abroad. But in the 1930s, tariff barriers were raised internationally, especially against Japanese textile exports. Their impact and the fear of further trade barriers led to a desire to secure markets by political or military action. By 1936, Japan's overseas territories, especially Manchuria, assured Japan's food imports, but only about 15% of Japan's imports of industrial products came from them. 70% of the zinc and tin consumed by Japan came from foreign sources, 90% of lead, and all raw cotton, wool, aluminium, and rubber. In the 1930s, a trading surplus with China, including Manchuria, was the main source of foreign exchange. By contrast, trade with Europe, the United States, and the British Dominions had a current deficit of 425 million yen. The essential trade with China was threatened by rising Chinese nationalism, expressed by anti-Japanese resentment and boycotts. Whilst 25% of Chinese imports had come from Japan in the 1920s, by 1932 this had been reduced to 14%. Japan's war with China began in 1937. Fighting began in July with an incident at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. The Japanese civilian authorities in Tokyo were now more belligerent even than the army, and Chiang Kai-shek was ready to force a conflict in northern China. Only as the leader of anti-Japanese nationalism could he survive and retain Soviet support in keeping the Chinese communists in temporary alliance. But Chiang's military was unsuccessful, and by the end of 1938, Japan had gained control over all of China's important ports, including Canton in the south. Chiang himself retreated to Chongqing in Sichuan, but despite repeated efforts, the Japanese failed to persuade him to work with them. So, in 1940, they set up their own puppet government under Wang Qingwei. Japanese atrocities during the war with China, especially in Nanjing, shocked world opinion and increased hostility towards Japan. Japanese aircraft also nearly killed the British ambassador, and Japan sank the American gunboat Panay, and British residents in Tientsin were deliberately humiliated by Japanese officials. Meanwhile, in the north, believing that the Soviet Union was the most dangerous enemy, the Japanese army launched major border battles, decisively defeated, however, by the Soviet Union, particularly in 1939 with the battles of Khalkhin-Gol. Events in Europe were of crucial importance to what Japanese policy developed. In 1936, Japan had signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany, later involving also Italy, seeking to counterbalance the Soviet Union. But in 1939, the Japanese were shocked by the unexpected Nazi-Soviet pact. Here we have Stalin shaking hands with the German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop. Initially, the war in Europe didn't offer any opportunities to Japan. To expand north was blocked by the Nazi-Soviet pact and the Soviet Union's clear military strength vis-à-vis the Japanese, whilst to expand south against Southeast Asia would mean war with Britain and France. But in May and June of 1940, Germany occupied both the Netherlands and France. This suggested easy conquests in French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies. Indochina was strategically important in Japan's war with China, and the Dutch East Indies were rich in natural resources, especially oil. Fearing that Britain or the United States might now seize these territories for themselves, the Japanese thought that they should preempt any such moves. Moreover, if Germany defeated Britain, then Malaya, with its rubber and tin, was another tempting prize. On the 27th of July 1940, the Japanese decided that it was necessary to avoid an attack on Britain, as the Japanese Navy believed that the Americans would then go to war in Britain's defense. It was better, they thought, to wait for Germany to defeat Britain, after which southern expansion without conflict would be possible. In September 1940, however, they entered into the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, hoping for a share in the spoils at the expense of the British, in return for helping Germany by discouraging American entry into the European war. Meanwhile, in July 1940, the Japanese had successfully pressured the British to close the Burma Road for 3 months, one of Chiang Kai-shek's few links with the outside world. Then, in September 1940, Japanese troops entered the northern part of French Indochina. The Dutch were also bullied into promising continuing supplies from the Dutch East Indies. But by 1941, the situation had changed dramatically. There were now two options for Japanese expansion. The northern option was to join in the destruction of the Soviet Union following the onset of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Or the southern option was, if the Soviet Union was not a threat in the north, then the Japanese could advance southward. The ruling elite, the Prime Minister, the Ministers of War, Navy, Home and Finance, the general and supply staffs of the Army and Navy, were uncertain which option to take. The Emperor and court officials were merely gloomy commentators. Preparations were made for both options. The Guangdong Army in Manchuria was reinforced for possible action. The Vichy French government was bullied into allowing Japanese forces to enter southern Indochina to set up advanced air and naval bases. Meanwhile, the Americans began to use economic pressure to check Japan and successfully encouraged the British and the Dutch. The Dutch government was then in exile in London to do the same. In response to Japan's moves into Indochina, which clearly threatened both Malaya and the Philippines, as well as the Dutch East Indies, Roosevelt offered to arrange for guaranteed neutralization of French Indochina. Japanese troops had already moved south by the time of FDR's offer reaching Tokyo, and the US freeze on Japanese assets and an embargo on oil came into effect. The British and the Dutch joined in. FDR had intended to allow for oil exports on a peacetime scale to be applied for, excluding aviation quality fuel. As Cordell Hunt, the American Secretary of State, had fallen ill, and FDR was in Newfoundland meeting Churchill, the responsible committee imposed the full embargo. However, for the Japanese, the decision now was whether to abandon their greater East Asian core prosperity sphere or go to war. So that's all I'm going to say for the moment. Thank you very much to you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement. If you want to like, comment and share on my videos to support my channel, you're very welcome to do so. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below. And next week we'll talk about American and British policies towards Japan. Have a good day.